Hi everyone, David Williams, Billionaire Boy. Today I'm going to read 2 chapters to you. I'm going to read chapters 3 and 4, and I've got a helper with me today who's going to start us off with some reading. So, vocabulary. Loitered. If you loiter, it means you're hanging around somewhere. To jeer. If you're jeering someone, you're kind of making fun of them, you're making horrible remarks about someone. And bluffing. If you say that you're bluffing, it means that you're kidding, you're joking, you're lying. Okay, so chapter 3. Are you going to come and read the first part for us?
Yeah.
Okay, come on then.
Right. Chapter 3. Who's the fattest? Finally, the big day came. Joe took off his diamond-encrusted watch and put his gold pen in the drawer. He looked at his designer black snakeskin bag his dad had bought him for his first day at the new school and put it back in the drawer in the cupboard. Even the bag had come in was too posh. But he found an old plastic one in the kitchen and put his school books in that. Joe was determined not to stand out from the back seat of his chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce. He had passed the local comprehensive many times on his way to St.
Cuthbert's, well done.
Cuthbert's and seen the kids pouring out of the school.
Well done, well read. Well, in year 2, clever boy. A rushing river of swinging bags and swear words and hair gel. Today, he was going to enter the gates for the first time. But he didn't want to arrive by Rolls Royce. That would be a pretty good hint to the other kids that he was rich. He instructed the chauffeur to drop him off at a nearby bus stop. It had been quite a few years since he had travelled by public transport, and as he waited at the bus stop, Joe tingled with excitement. I can't change that, said the bus driver. Joe hadn't realised that a £50 note was not going to be welcome to pay for a £2 fare, and had to get off the bus. Sighing, he began to walk the 2 miles to school, his flabby thighs rubbing together as he took each step. Finally, Joe reached the school gates. For a moment, he loitered nervously outside. He'd spent so long living a life of wealth and privilege. How on earth was he going to fit in with these kids? Joe took a deep breath and marched across the playground. Okay. At registration, there was only one other kid sitting on his own. Joe looked over at him. He was fat, just like Joe, with a mop of curly hair. When he saw Joe looking at him, he smiled, and when registration was finished, he came over. I'm Bob, said the fat boy.
Bob!
Don't be silly. Hi, Bob, replied Joe. The bell had just rung and they waddled along the corridor to the first lesson of the day. I'm Joe, he added. It was weird to be in a school where no one knew who he was, where he wasn't Bum Boy or Billionaire Bum or the Bum Fresh Kid. I'm so glad you're here, Joe, in the class, I mean. Why's that? Asked Joe. He was excited. It looked like he might have found his first friend already. Because I'm not the fattest boy in school anymore, Bob said confidently, as if stating an independently verified fact. Joe scowled, then stopped for a second and studied Bob. It looked to him like he and the other boy were about the same level of fattiness. How much do you weigh then? Demanded Joe grumpily. Well, how much do you weigh? Said Bob. Well, I asked you first. Bob paused for a second. About 8 stone. Well, I'm 7 stone, said Joe, lying. No way are you 7 stone, said Bob angrily. I'm 12 stone, and you're much fatter than me. You just said you were 8 stone, said Joe accusingly. I was 8 stone, replied Bob, when I was a baby. That afternoon it was cross-country running. What a dreadful ordeal for any day at school, not least your first day. It was a yearly torture that seemed designed solely to humiliate those kids who weren't sporty, a category Bob and Joe could definitely be squeezed into. "Where's your running kit, Bob?" shouted Mr. Bruce, the sadistic PE teacher, as Bob made his way onto the playing field. Bob was wearing his Y-fronts and vest, and his appearance was greeted by a huge wave of laughter from the other kids. "Someone must have hidden it, sir," answered a shivering Bob. "Likely story," scoffed Mr. Bruce. Like most PE teachers, it was difficult to imagine him wearing anything other than a tracksuit. That's very stereotypical. "Do I still have to do the run, sir?" asked a hopeful Bob. "Oh, yes, boy. You don't get off that easily. Right, everyone, on your marks, get set. Wait for it. Go!" At first, Joe and Bob sprinted away like all the other kids, but after about 3 seconds they were both out of breath and were forced to walk. Soon everyone else had disappeared into the distance and the two fat boys were left alone. "I come last every year," said Bob, unwrapping a Snickers and taking a large bite. "All the other kids always laugh at me. They get showered and dressed and wait at the finish line. They could all go home, but instead they just wait to jeer at me." Joe frowned. That didn't sound like fun. He decided he didn't want to be last and quickened his pace a little, making sure he was at least half a step in front of Bob. Bob glared at him and piled on the speed, going up to at least half a mile an hour. From the determined expression on his face, Joe knew that Bob was hoping that this year was his golden chance not to finish last. Joe sped up a little more. They were now almost jogging. The race was on. For the ultimate prize. Who was going to finish second to last? Joe really didn't want to be beaten at cross-country running by a fat boy in his vest and pants on his first day at school. After what seemed like an eternity, the finish line hazed into sight. Both boys were out of breath with all this power waddling. Suddenly, disaster struck Joe. A painful stitch burst in his side. "Ow!" cried Joe. "What's the matter?" asked Bob, now quite a few centimetres in the lead. "I've got a stitch. I've got to stop. Ow!" "You're bluffing. A 15-stone girl pulled that on me last year and ended up beating me by a fraction of a second." "Ow, it's true," said Joe, holding his side tightly. "I ain't falling for it, Joe. You are going to be last, and this year all the kids in the year are going to be laughing at you," said Bob triumphantly, as he edged ahead still further. Being laughed at on his first day at school was the last thing Joe wanted. He'd had enough of being laughed at when he was at St. Cuthbert's. However, the stitch was becoming more and more painful with every step. It was as if it was burning a hole in his side. "How about I give you a fiver if to come last?" he said. "No way," replied Bob, through heaving breaths. "A tenner?" "No." 20 quid. Try harder. 50 quid. Bob stopped and looked around at Joe. 50 quid, he said. "That's a lot of chocolate." "Yeah," said Joe, "tons." "You've got yourself a deal, but I want the Wonga now." Joe searched through his shorts and pulled out a £50 note. "What's that?" asked Bob. "It's a £50 note. I've never seen one before. Where did you get it?" It was my birthday last week, you see," said Joe, stumbling over his words a little, "and my dad gave me that as a present." The marginally fatter boy studied it for a moment, holding it up to the light as if it was a priceless artefact. "Wow, your dad must be loaded," he said. The truth would have blown Bob's fat mind, that Mr. Spud had given his son £2 million as a birthday present, so Joe kept stum. "Nah, not really," he said. "Go on then," said Bob. "I'll come last again for 50 quid. I would finish tomorrow if you like." "Oh, just a few paces behind me'll be fine," said Joe. "Then it'll look real." Joe edged ahead, still gripping his side in pain. Hundreds of little cruelly smiling faces were coming into focus now. The new boy crossed the finish line with only a hum of mocking laughter. Trailing behind was Bob, clutching his £50 note, since there was no pockets in his Y-fronts. As he neared the finish line, the kids started chanting, "Blob, blob, blob, blob." The chants grew louder and louder, and they started clapping in time too. You see all the blobs. Poor Bob, that's horrible. Shouldn't call people names. Undeterred, Bob hurled his body across the finish line. Poor kid. All laughing. The other kids fell around laughing, pointing at Bob as he bent over and panted for breath. Turning around, Joe felt a sudden twinge of guilt. As the school kids dispersed, he went over to Bob and helped him stand up straight. "Thanks," said Joe. "You're welcome," said Bob. "To be honest, I should have done that anyway. If you came last on your very first day, you'd never hear the end of it. But next year you're on your own. I don't care if you give me £1,000,000, I ain't coming last again." Joe thought about his £2,000,000 birthday cheque. "What about £2,000,000? He joked. "Deal," said Bob, laughing. "Imagine if you really did have that much money. It'd be crazy. I guess you would have everything you ever wanted." Joe forced a smile. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." Oh, isn't that cruel? Kids can be so cruel. You shouldn't laugh at other people just because of the way they look. I feel a bit uncomfortable even saying the word fat whilst I'm reading this. You shouldn't call people names. Anyway, David Walliams has written it for us to have a little giggle at, and it's not about real people, so we're okay to giggle at this story. Loo Rolls is chapter 4. "So, did you forget your kit on purpose?" asked Joe. Mr. Bruce had locked up the changing rooms by the time Joe and Bob had finished their cross-country run. Well, cross-country walk. They stood outside the grey concrete building, Bob shivering in his pants. They'd already been to find the school secretary, but there was absolutely no one left in the whole place. Well, apart from the caretaker, who didn't seem to speak English, or any other language for that matter. "No," replied Bob, a little hurt at the suggestion. "I may not be the fastest runner, but I'm not that much of a coward." They trudged through the school grounds, Joe in his singlet and shorts, and Bob in his vest and pants. They looked like two rejects from a boy band audition. "So, who took it?" asked Joe. "I don't know. It might be the Grubs. They're the school bullies." "The Grubs?" "Yeah, the twins." "Oh," said Joe, "I haven't met them yet." "You will," replied Bob dolefully. "You know, I feel really bad about taking your birthday money off you." "Oh, you don't have to," said Joe. "It's fine." "But £50 is a lot of money," Bob protested. £50 was not a lot of money to the Spuds. Here are a few things Joe and his dad would do with £50 notes. Light them instead of bits of old newspaper to get the barbecue going. Keep a pad of them by the telephone to use them as post-it notes. Line the hamster cage with handfuls of them and then throw them out after a week when they began to smell of hamster wee. Let the same hamster use one as a towel after it had a shower. Filter coffee through them. Make paper hats out of them to wear on Christmas Day. Blow their noses on them. Spit chewed up chewing gum into them before crumpling them and placing them in the hand of a butler, who would then put them in the hand of a footman, who would then put them in the hand of a maid, who would then put them in the bin. Make paper aeroplanes out of them and throw them at each other. Wallpaper the downstairs loo with them. "I never asked," said Bob. "What does your dad do?" Joe panicked for a moment. He makes loo rolls," he said, only lying a tiny bit. "Loo rolls," said Bob. He couldn't suppress his smile. "Yeah," replied Joe defiantly. "He makes loo rolls." Bob stopped smiling. "That doesn't sound like it pays all that well." Joe winced. No, it doesn't." "Then I guess your dad had to save for weeks to give you 50 quid. Here you go." Bob carefully handed the now slightly crumpled £50 note back to Joe. "No, you keep it," protested Joe. Bob pressed the note into Joe's hand. "It's your birthday money. You keep it." Joe smiled uncertainly and closed his hand over the money. "Thank you, Bob. So what does your dad do?" "My dad died last year." They continued walking in silence for a moment. All Joe could hear was the sound of his heart beating. He couldn't think of anything to say. All he knew was that he felt awful for his new friend. Then he remembered that when someone died, people sometimes said, "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not your fault," said Bob. Well, I'm sorry he died." "Yeah, I'm sorry too." "How did he, you know?" cancer. It was really scary. He just got more and more ill, and then one day they took me out of school and I went to the hospital. We sat by his bed for ages and you could hear his breath rattling, and then suddenly the sound just stopped. I ran outside to get the nurse and she came in and said he was gone. It's just me and my mum now. What does your mum do? She works at Tesco and the checkout. That's where she met my dad. He would shop on Saturday mornings. He used to joke that he only came in for a pint of milk but left with a wife. He sounds like he was funny, said Joe. He was, said Bob, smiling. Mum's got another job too. She's a cleaner at an old people's home in the evenings, just to make ends meet. Wow, said Joe. Doesn't she get tired? Yeah, said Bob. So do I a lot of the cleaning. So I do a lot of the cleaning and stuff. Joe felt really sorry for Bob. Since he was 8, Joe had never had to do anything at home. There was always the butler or the maid or gardener or the chauffeur or whoever to do everything. He took the note out of his pocket. If there was one person who needed the money more than him, it was Bob. Please, Bob, keep the £50. No, I don't want to. I'd feel bad. Well, let me at least buy you some chocolate. You've got a deal, said Bob. Let's go to Raj's. And I'm going to stop there. I hope you enjoyed that. I know. Suddenly got, who are you?
Luke Skywalker.
Luke Skywalker, okay. And I'll read to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.